How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Zayin, Daf 57 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, 57 is cool. We are getting a bit into like some chicken anatomy. Sheesh, I have watched way too many videos. I wouldn't know about too many videos, but I have watched a lot of chicken butchering videos. Try to understand like how chickens work. Anyways, yeah, I've watched a lot of chickens get butchered and stuff. Yeah, just try to understand exactly how the ribs work and all that kind of stuff. It's actually not so easy because, whereas like with lambs and other things, you'll actually like open them up because they're so big, and you're like actually gonna like really go like bone by bone. Chickens, you don't really, except I learned something called spatchcocking. It's a hilarious name, but it's a real thing. Spatchcocking. It's a way to who decided to call it that? It's a hilarious name, but it's a real thing. To spatchcock a chicken is to like open it up, kind of. It's like butterfly kind of. So I learned about that today. And so when you spatchcock the chicken, you actually do kind of open up the inside of it. But every other way to prepare chicken, you basically don't really get an inside, so it's hard to kind of see what the ribs look like and like how the lungs fit in. So we're gonna get into that today a bit. So hopefully I'll be able to explain that well enough. Anyways, so yeah, today we're getting into like, a few weeks ago we got into like sheep and cow kind of like details. So today it's not all about chicken details today, but like we're more at the beginning. At the beginning we can get into it a little bit. I don't know. I watched a lot of chicken butchering videos. Anyways, all right. So what are we talking about today? So Lamaisa, the truth is that the main sugya of today's daf really is when thighs get disconnected from the thigh bone. That's like the main thing. Is it kosher? Is it not? Right? We've learned about it in the context of, right, that was one of the shev shmaitza, right? That was one of the, by animals, that was one of the Amoraic treifas, the buka de atma. If the thigh bone if the hip bone gets disconnected from the joint. So that's kind of the main sugya, really in the context of birds, if that is going to be treif or not. At the beginning, we're going to talk a little bit about lungs as well. It's a pretty interesting daf. So friends, join me. Let's have a great time studying Daf Nun Zayin of Masechta Chullin. Alright, friends, we begin on Daf Nun Zayin, Daf 57 of Masechta Chullin, second line of the daf. Says the Gemara, Nishtabu Raglas. That of course is an excerpt from our Mishnah. That the Mishnah, one of the examples of a kosher bird is if the legs are broken. Now we had said that that's either the chicken legs have three sections to them, right? The yarech, the shok, and the shok is basic, right? The yarech is like the thigh, right? That's I've watched so many chicken butchering videos today, just like to understand like how they fit into like the pieces of chicken that we recognize. So when you like eat like a thigh, so you're eating the yarech, that's the thigh bone, and then if you eat the polka, that's the shok, and then where they cut that off, then there's like the foot under there. So if like the foot part is broken, then that's fine. I think we talked about this yesterday. If the shok is broken, it's okay as long as it doesn't break through the skin. Anyways, so it says the Gemara, Hahu tzano de inkure de ase the kami de Rava. There was a basket full of birds with broken legs that came before Rava. Bodke Rava b'tzomis agidin ve'achshrei. Rava checked out the tzomis agidin to make sure that all of the sinews were intact, and since they were intact, he said that they were kosher. Now, let's take a look at this. First of all, let's take a look at the tzomis agidin for a second. Okay, so what we are looking at is the tzomis agidin of a bird, of a chicken. So what are we looking at over here? Obviously, at the bottom, there's the chicken foot. And then there's that joint where the chicken foot connects with the shok. The shok is essentially the drumstick. And normally they will give it a chop right by that joint, and you don't eat the feet. Anyways, by that joint, right above that joint, is the tzomes hagidin. In a bird, there are 16 sinews that are at the tzomes hagidin. In an animal, there are 3. In a bird, there are 16. So Rava was making sure that all of those 16 sinews that are meant to be there were accounted for. And since they were, he said that these birds are kosher. Amar Rav Yehuda Marab, says Rav Yehuda in the name of Rab, Shmutas Yad B'Beima Kshera, if the arm, if the foreleg, if the arm of a animal is dislocated, it is kosher. You could read the parentheses here. Shmutas Yerech B'Beima Treifa, but if the hip bone, if the thigh bone, if the yarech, that's the top bone in the leg of the animal, gets, and that's the one with the circular kind of ball and socket kind of bone that fitting into the hip, into the thigh or whatever. So if that gets disconnected, and not just disconnected, but also the ligament, tendon. What's a tendon versus the ligament? I don't know. Rav Neil, you familiar with tendons and ligaments? Or was there a different word? I don't know. A tendon, let's just call it a tendon, right? In that joint where the thigh bone, that ball goes into the socket, in between the ball and the socket, there's some kind of ligament or tendon or something that holds it together. If that tendon or ligament or whatever is gone, so it's treif, right? So if the arm is dislocated, that's fine. If the leg is dislocated, right, the yarech is dislocated, that is treif. Shmutas yarech be'of treifa. And similarly, says Rav Yehuda in the name of Rab, that if the yarech gets dislocated from the thigh, from the hip in a bird, it is treifa as well. Shmutas gaf be'of treifa, and continues Rav Yehuda Marav, and he says, if the wing bone gets disconnected, gets disconnected from its socket, and the ligaments are gone or whatever, also treifa. Why is that treifa? Because chayshinon shema nikva hareya, because we are concerned that maybe the lung got punctured. This took me a really long time to try to figure out how lungs work in chickens. It took me a really long time to try to figure out how lungs work in chickens. Hopefully I have a better idea. I think I just need to, as I said yesterday, I think the chicken shechita was 1 week too early. If it was today, I would be all over that. And I would be able to tell you exactly how the lungs work. But Akopanim, this is my understanding after many hours of watching chicken butchering videos and consulting with my friend Yosef Goodman. So we're looking here at some chicken lungs. So the photo on the left are these chicken lungs, and what that tube at the top is, that's the trachea. So you have the trachea, and then the trachea kind of splits into 2 paths, go right into 2, going in. Those red marshmallows are actually chicken lungs. I'll go upon him. If you were expecting marshmallows, you might be surprised. Anyways, those red things at the end are chicken lungs. Okay, now if you'll notice, each of those lungs has like 3 lines on them, i.e. the 3 lines dividing them into 4 sections. Now, if you look to the right, the photo on the right, you can see the chicken spine, basically. Right, so they've removed the sternum in there. So what you see is a chicken lying on its back. And then right kind of like where the neck goes into the body, you see the spine. You'll notice there that there are basically 4 sections there, right? 1, 2, 3. There's like 4 sections in between the bones. Those lungs, I believe, fit right into the spine. And I think that those markings that you see on the lungs are be'etzem where they were pressed against the spine. So another noticeable point, which is going to be relevant a little bit later, is that the bones of the chicken spine are like thin and pointy, right? As opposed to, maybe I'll even pull it up. Do I want to pull it? No, I don't want to get into it right now. But I do just want to point out, if you look at the ribs in the chicken spine thingy, they are like thin, right? They are kind of thin bones, and that is what those lines are on the lungs. Anyways, okay, so therefore, so let's move on. So that is all to say. Now, when you look at this is a photo of a chicken wing with the lungs. So the blue arrow is pointing to the chicken wing joint. So that is where the wing kind of joints into the body. I just saw something fly around over here. I don't like when things are flying around. They distract me. So fly away somewhere else. Akuponim. So the chicken wing. So the wing connects to the body where the blue arrow is, but you see, it's also, the connection is also where there's like a black arrow that I didn't add, but it was like from the photo that I photoed. That black arrow is pointing to the lungs, right? So as we saw in the previous slide, how like the lungs kind of fit right into those ribs. So those are so what you're looking at there is essentially the ribs with the lung pressed into them, I believe. So the concern is that if the wing gets dislocated, it could somehow puncture a lung or ruin the lungs. So that is what Rav Yehuda Amar Rab says, which is that if the wing gets dislocated, so then we are concerned that it could have punctured, hit against the lungs and punctured the lung. Okay, so maybe let's read that again. Let's read the whole statement again. It says, in the name Rav Shmutas Yad B'Bei Meksher. In an animal, if the arm is dislocated, kosher. Shmutas Yerech B'Bei Treifa. If the thigh bone, the yarech, gets dislocated, it's treif. Shmutas Yarech B'Of. If the thigh bone, if the yarech gets dislocated in a bird, it's also treif. Shmutas Gaf Be'of, and if the wing gets dislocated on a bird, treifa, it is also treif. Chayshinon Shema Nikva Hareya, because as we saw in the slides, we are concerned that if the wing got disconnected, it may have, probably the concern is probably for puncturing. It may have kind of come in contact with the lung and punctured it. Ushmuel Amar Tibadik. Shmuel says, wait a second. I understand the concern, but let's not automatically jump to conclusions and say that the bird is treif. Instead, let's check. Let's look to see if there are any holes in the lung. And Rashi tells us how we do that. We basically stick a tube into the trachea and blow and see if any air is escaping from the lungs. V'chein Amar Yochanan Tibadik. Rabbi Yochanan says, like Shmuel, that run a test to see if any air is leaking from the lung. I'm going to have a shluck of tea and we'll go weiter. We'll see Chizkiya's shita. Now says Chizkiya Omar says Chizkiya ein reya la'of. Chizkiya says something very interesting, which the Gemara is going to question in just a moment. But says Chizkiya, birds don't have lungs. Rabbi Yochanan Amar yeshlo. Rabbi Yochanan argues on, I thought that Chizkiya was his Rebbe. I think, who said, maybe I saw in the art school or something. So I saw they said Chizkiya was his colleague. I didn't think that Chizkiya was Rabbi Yochanan's colleague. I thought that was his Rebbe. Anyways. But Rabbi Yochanan argues, and he says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar yesh lo, that birds do have lungs, the yeshno ke'ole shalvered, and it is red like the leaf of a rose. Ben agapayim, and it is between its wings, as we saw in the slide earlier, that the wings kind of are on the side of the bird, right where the lungs are inside of the bird. My ein rea loaf. Now, what does this very peculiar argument of Chizkiah mean? There are no lungs in birds? If you're going to say that that's what it means, but we can look, we could see, we could tell birds have lungs. So it can't possibly mean that birds don't have lungs. They do. So maybe what it means is that a bird cannot be a treifa on account of its lungs. So yeah, birds, maybe what Chizkiah is saying is, yeah, of course birds have lungs, but the lungs won't make the bird a treifa. But Vatani Levi, but we learned yesterday from Levi, treifas shamanu chachamim bebehema kenegden ba'of, that whatever treifas there are for animals, there are for birds. And we spent a whole bunch of time the other week discussing treifas related to lungs in an animal. And we learned that if a lung, among other things, but if a lung is punctured in an animal, the animal's treif. And Levi says whatever treifas there are for animals, there are for birds as well. So therefore, it would stand that the that their lungs of a bird can make it treif if it's punctured. Yosar lein of, and as we said yesterday, that there is actually an additional treifa when it comes to birds, in that nishbar etzem, if the skull breaks, afal pishalo nikab krum shel mach, even though the membrane of the brain did not was not penetrated or whatever, pierced. Anyways, that's an extra one by birds. But the fact of the matter is that the lungs, so meaning, no, Chizkiah said that there are no lungs in birds. First of all, there are lungs in birds. And if you're going to tell me, it means that, yeah, but lungs won't make the birds treif. What do you mean? If they make an animal treif, they'll make the birds treif. Ela ein lo linofel velo lichomer. No, what it means is that if right, when it comes to nafla min agag, right, or yesterday we had a few examples by a bird where you have to wait me'es leis, you have to wait 24 hours to make sure that it's going to survive, and then you have to check, after you set, it's after 24 hours, you slaughter it, you still have to do a bedika, you have to check to make sure that there are no other treifas related to it having fallen or being trampled on. So maybe it means that when you're doing that bedika, it excludes the lungs. You don't need to check the lungs in that case to see if it's treif. And similarly, if it fell in a fire or something that we talked about yesterday, checking the intestines to make sure that there's no red spots or green spots, depending, we're talking about the intestines or the heart or whatever, liver. So you don't need to check the lungs. My time, how come? Omar Rav Chana, says Rav Chana, Hol v'rovtzlo se'ah magino saleh, because its ribs protect it. What does it mean that its ribs protect it? So this is what I was kind of getting at earlier, but I didn't want to get into it earlier, so I'm getting into it now. So in this slide, we're comparing animal versus chicken ribs. Again, we talked about this, we touched on this earlier, so hopefully this shouldn't be too difficult. But if you look at the slide on the right is a chicken rib, chicken ribs. Right in the middle there is the spinal column with the ribs going out to the side. And on the left is either a sheep or a goat. Right, let's call it a goat. I don't know if it's a sheep or a goat. It's probably a sheep, but I'll call it a goat. I feel like that's not the first time I've said that. Anyways, so there's those goat ribs. So if you compare the goat ribs, so what's interesting is, imagine you have a rib, okay? Let's just say you have a rib. And the rib is, let's say, 1 inch wide, okay? I don't know if that's a lot or a little for rib. I don't know. It's not, it doesn't matter. If you have a rib and it's, let's say, 1 inch wide, but its thickness is 1/4 of an inch. So in an animal, those ribs would be like one next to each other width-wise. So you'd have like 1 inch and then another inch and then another inch. Those ribs would be width-wise, but they would only have 1/4 of an inch of depth, i.e. protecting, right, but what's between the outside world and the kishkas of the animal is basically just 1/4 of an inch of thickness, right? Because in an animal, the ribs go kind of one next to the other widthwise. On a chicken, though, as you see on the photo on the right, though the rib bones really, first of all, they're more spaced out than they are in the goat. They're more. It's as if you, instead of laying out the rib bones widthwise, you flip them 90 degrees, and they're kind of thickness wise, but and therefore you see in the chicken photo that the ribs are kind of like pointing in, into the rib cage, and there's more space between them. So why is that important? It's important because we're saying that in the case of nefula, when it falls, right, the case where you would have to wait 24 hours, and then after you shecht it, you have to check to make sure that it's in fact kosher. You don't need to check the lungs because the lungs are protected by these ribs, and these ribs are longer, right? Because they have the as you see, they kind of the longer side is going in. It's hard to describe, but you could see it in the photo. Kind of, you could see kind of that right that there's more space between them, and that they kind of, you can see them like pointing in vertically. So, and that also explains why, as we saw earlier on the lungs, there were those lines. And what that means is that if it takes a spill, if it falls, there's there's that 1 inch in our example of thickness between where it impacted and where the lungs are, and also because of the space in between the individual ribs, it kind of has, if it needs to get to squish into more space, it can squish into more space. Okay, so therefore, so getting back to Chizkiah said that there are no lungs in birds. We said, come on, of course there are lungs in birds. Okay, so then what does Chizkiah mean? Maybe what it means is that you don't need to check the lungs for treifas in the event of nefula, or in the event of falling into a fire. So my time, so Amar of Chana Ove Rov Tzosem Aginos Aleh the Ha Mida Amar B'Yechanan Yeshlo V'Yeshna Ka'al Shaver. The problem with that is that Rabbi Yochanan argued, right? We said Chizkiah says that birds don't have ribs, to which Rabbi Yochanan says Ma Pitom Chizkiah says that birds don't have lungs, to which Rabbi Yochanan says Ma Pitom, of course they have lungs and they are red. So it sounds like what's going on is Chizkiah is literally saying that birds don't have lungs, and Rabbi Yochanan saying, yes, they do. So it sounds like Chizkiah at the end of the day is saying birds don't have lungs, full stop. So again, from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan responds to Chizkiah, and he says, Yeshlo, no, mapitom, of course birds have lungs. The Yeshno ke'ola shovered, and they are red like a rose petal. Benagapayim, and they are between the wings. Michad Chizkiah, implying that according to Chizkiah, there simply are no lungs. Rather, they say in Eretz Yisrael, in the name of Rabbi Yosef Beb Chanina, midvarav shel Bribi, from the words of Bribi of Chizkiah, one of the Gedolei Ador, Nikar she'eno bakir b'tarnagolim, clearly he does not eat a lot of chicken. And says Rashi, Veloshem b'dichusahu, that was said kind of lightheartedly. Okay, we don't know what Chizkiah is saying. We can't understand why he'd be saying that there are no lungs in birds. Of course, there are lungs in birds. Maybe he just doesn't eat a lot of chicken. After that discussion of chicken lungs, we get back to discussing disconnected chicken thighs. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rab. Now says Rav Huna in the name of Rab, Shmutas Yarech Ba'of, if the thigh bone gets disconnected in a bird, in a chicken, Kshera. It's Kshera. Now Rav Yehuda had said in the name of Rab earlier that the thigh, the Yarech getting disconnected is treif. Rav Huna is saying in the name of Rab that the Yarech getting disconnected is kosher. Amalei Rabba bar Rav Huna le Rav Huna. So Rav Huna's son, Rabba bar Rav Huna, says to Rav Huna, but the rabbis who came from Pumbedisa, who are those rabbis? So whenever I see something like this, and I notice it, I look back to Masechta Sanhedrin Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, where it lists all of these kinds of things. So now I didn't find over there the Rabbanan de Asu mi Pumbedisa, who it is. I did see there that whenever the Gemara references Amorai de Pumbedisa, that is Rabba and Rav Yosef. Maybe it's a reference to them. I don't know. Maybe it's a reference to Rabba and Rav Yosef. But anyways, says Rabba bar Ravuna, he says the Rabbanan de Asu mi Pumbedisa, that the rabbis who came from Pumbedisa, they said Amru Rav Yehuda Mishmei Rav Amar, that they said, that Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rab, Shmutas Yarech Be'ov Treifa, that when the thigh of a bird gets disconnected, it's treif. So Rav Huna had said the name of Rab that it's kosher. However, apparently in Pumbedisa they say that Rav Yehuda says the name of Rab that it's treif. Omar lei, so Rav Huna responds to his son Rabba, Bri, my son, Naira Ufashta. Every river has its own flow, and every town has its own traditions. And says Rav Huna, look, Rav really does hold, like I'm saying, that Me'ikra did, that a dislocated thigh bone in a bird is kosher. What happened is, the people in Pumbedisa, they say that it's treif. And Rav one time was in Pumbedisa. They in Pumbedisa hold that a disconnected hip bone, disconnected thigh bone in a bird is treif. And if they hold it's treif, he wasn't going to say that it's mutter, if that's the minig that they hold that it's treif. So he wasn't going to get involved. Now Rav Yehuda saw that Rav didn't say otherwise, and Rav Yehuda understood that to mean that Rav Shita is that a thigh bone that gets disconnected is treif. So argues Rav Huna, the fact of the matter is that Rav holds that a thigh bone that gets disconnected is kosher. Also, Rab Abba, Ashkechei the Rab Yirmiyah bar Abba. Rab Abba found Rab Yirmiyah bar Abba, the Kabodik B'tzomas Hagidin. And Rab Yirmiyah bar Abba, who was a student of Rav, he was checking the Tzomas Hagidin. We saw the Tzomas Hagidin earlier, right? That is all of those 16 sinews right above the foot joint. And Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was checking the Tzomas Hagidin. Amalei, and Rabbi Abba says to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Lamalei, Lemar Kulei, I don't understand why you need to check the Tzomas Hagidin. After all, Rav Huna Amar Rav, Rav Huna had said the name Rav, Shmutas Yarech Be'ov Ksher, that by a bird, even if the whole leg comes off, even if the thigh bone is disconnected, effectively disconnecting the entire leg, the yarech, the shok, the regel. So even if the thigh bone gets disconnected, effectively disconnecting the entire leg, Rav Huna said in the name of Rav that it's kosher. So the Tzomas Hagidin, which is at one of the, right, which is at the joint at the bottom of the leg, towards the bottom of the leg, why do you have to check that? Kilu, even if higher up, even if the whole leg was disconnected, it's kosher. Why do you have to check the Tzomas Hagidin? So Amalei, so Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba responds, Ono masnisin yadainu. He says, look, you might be right, but there's a Mishnah. A Mishnah that we're going to learn on Daf Ayin Vav. A Mishnah from Perek Behema Makasha Leiled. And that Mishnah says, Behema shenechtechu ragleh min arkuba lamata, that a animal that its leg has been cut below its arkuba. It's a little bit unclear if that is, so I'm going to say that it means the lowest joint, the joint that we've been talking about, but the one right below the Tzomas Hagidin, right below the yellow foot. So if the foot is broken or cut off from below that joint, kshera, the bird is kshera. Min arkuba lamaila, but above that point, above that joint, psula. It's possible. V'chein shenitel tzomas hagidin, and also so this, by the way, is talking about animals, right? So it's the same thing, right? Birds, animals, they all have that 3-bone leg, but this is talking about animals, right? So if below that lower joint, the animal's foot is cut off, the animal is kosher. If it's above that joint, it is treif. And the tzomes hagidin, right, the point where the sinews meet. Now, in an animal, there's only 3 sinews there, unlike a bird where there's 16. But if those gidin, if those sinews are cut, so then it is treif. V'amra Rav Allah, and Rav says about that, v'chein be'of. And Rav says that the same holds true for a bird. And therefore, Rabbi Abba sees Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba checking the tzomas hagidin. Rabbi Abba says, I don't understand why you have to check the tzomas hagidin, even if the whole leg is missing, is disconnected. Rav says that it's kosher. Why are you checking like the bottom part of the leg? So Rabbi bar Abba says, look, I'll tell you, there's a Mishnah that says you have to check it. And Rav says that Mishnah applies to birds as well. So I'm checking it. So Rabbi Abba says, okay, but then doesn't that mean that Rabbi Abba says, it doesn't that mean that Rav is contradicting himself? On the one hand, he's saying, right, Rav Huna says the name of Rav. On the one hand, that if the thigh is entirely disconnected, the animal's kosher, and yet he'd say that if the tzomas hagidin are cut, it's possible. That's just a section of the leg. The whole leg is allowed to be missing. Ishtik and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was quiet, not because he didn't know how to answer, but as we will see in a moment, he didn't feel the need to respond. Omerle, to which Rav Abba says, you know what? I think I have an idea. Dilma shani le ben shmuta lachatucha. Maybe Rav makes a distinction between dislocation and cutting. That when the thigh is dislocated, the bird remains kosher. But if you have the sinews by the tzomas hagidin that have been cut, so there it could be treif. There's a difference between dislocating and cutting. Amalei, to which Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, Ve'at mifarashas shmaitze derav. What, you think that you just came up with that big chiddush that there's a distinction, that Rav says that maybe Rav says that there's a distinction between dislocating and cutting? Beferish Amar Rav shmuta kshera chatucha psula. Rav himself makes that distinction explicitly, which is why Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba did not feel the need to respond to Rav Abba's question when he says, oh, it sounds like Rav is contradicting himself. Rav Yirmiyah just kind of didn't respond. Because he didn't. There's no contradiction. Rav himself already deals with this, and Rav Abba kind of came up with this solution. Oh wow, maybe there's a distinction between dislocating and cutting. To which Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, "Look, it's not your chiddush. Rav himself says it." Vatitama, and don't be so surprised about the fact that if the leg is disconnected, it's kosher, but if the tzomas hagidin is cut, that it's possible. She'arei chotcha mikan v'meisa chotcha mikan v'chaysa. Because after all, we see on the bird or on the animal itself that you can cut it up. You can cut off the leg at the hip bone, at the joint, and it can still live. And yet, if you cut that tzomas hagidin, it won't. So therefore, apparently, the fact of the matter is that this is reflective of reality, that you could remove the leg and it will live, but if you cut that tzomas hagidin, it will be a treifa. Kisalik Rabbi Abba, when Rabbi Abba made Aliyat Eretz Yisrael, who did he find there? Ashkechel Reb Zera, he found Reb Zera. Now, of course, Rabbi Abba and Reb Zera both made Aliyah Eretz Yisrael from Babble. They are the two examples that I could remember in Shas where we have two students of, it's basically identical stories. This came up also recently, that they're identical stories of Reb Abba and Reb Zera, that when they moved to Eretz Yisrael, they had to kind of slip away from Reb Yehuda because he did not want them to go. Anyways, so Reb Zera had moved to Eretz Yisrael first, and then Reb Abba joined him subsequently. And so Kisalig Reb Abba, when Reb Abba moved to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkechel Reb Zera, he finds Reb Zera, the Yosef Amar, who was saying, Amar, the Yosef Amar, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Shmutas Yarich Ba'of, Treifa. Rav Huna says in the name of Rab that if the thigh bone of a bird gets disconnected, treif. Now we had said earlier that Rav Yehuda says the name of Rab treif. Rav Huna says the name of Rab kosher. Now Reb Zera is saying Rav Huna says the name of Rab treif. Omar lei, to which Reb Abba responds to Reb Zera, Chaye demar biyom desalik mar lahacha. Look, Reb Zera, since subsequent to the time that you moved and made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, Havalon Pischin Peh Kamid Rav Huna, we had an opportunity to learn and to discuss this sugya with Rav Huna. V'sha'ilnei v'omarlon, we asked him and he answered, Shmutas Yarich Ba'of Kshera. As we had said earlier, that in fact, Rav Huna says that when the thigh bone is disconnected in a bird, it is Kshera. That Rav Huna says the name of Rab, that it is Kshera. And now we are going to have a repeat of the anecdote with Reb Abba and Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, Vashkechose Nami, Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, and I saw, says Reb Abba, I saw Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, Yosef V'ka Badik B'Tzomas Hagidin, who was checking, inspecting the Tzomas Hagidin to make sure that all 16 sinews were there. V'akshele, and I asked him, Lo Savala Mar Hadam Rav Huna Amarav, don't you hold of that which Rav Huna says the name of Rab, Shmutas Yarich Ba'ov Kshera, that when the thigh gets disconnected from a bird, it remains kosher. So why are you checking the Tzomas Hagidin? Obviously, it's as long as obviously if the whole thigh could be missing, certainly the Tzomas Hagidin should not be an issue. So Omar Lei, to which Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba responded to Reb Abba, I know the Mishnah from Daf Ayin Vav. That a animal whose leg is cut off below that lower joint between the shoke and the bottom part of the foot. If where am I? So right, so that joint, so below that joint, essentially the bottom part of the foot, if it is broken or cut off, kshera, minarkuba l'mayla, but above that joint, psula. V'chein shenital tzomas hagidin, also if the tzomas hagidin is cut, so then psula, it's treif. V'amar Rav Allah, and Rav says v'chein ba'of, that this is not just by animals but by birds as well. V'amri lei, and I said to Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, Yochi kasha d'Rav Rav, but then isn't Rav contradicting himself? On the one hand, he says that the whole leg could be disconnected. On the other hand, and it's kshera. On the other hand, he's saying we have to check the tzomas hagidin, and if any of the sinews are missing, then it's treif. Why do you have to check the tzomas hagidin? The whole leg could be missing. It could be disconnected. Ishtik, and Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba did not respond. Ve'akshi lay, and then I said to Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba, V'dilma shani lei l'Rav bein shmuta l'chatucha. Maybe Rav distinguishes between disconnecting to dislocating and cutting. That dislocating could be kshera, whereas cutting the tzomas hagidin would be treif. Omar v'Omar li, and Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba responded to me, V'at b'farashas shmaiti d'Rav. What do you think that you're coming up with this answer? A big chiddush in Rav's shita, beferish Omar Rav. Rav had said this himself explicitly. Shmuta kshera chatucha psula. That dislocation is kosher, whereas cutting is possible. Vat ma biyadach. Now says Reb Abba to Reb Zera. Now new. So what do you say, right? So Reb Abba had found Reb Zera. Reb Zera was saying over Rav Huna, the name of Rav, that if the thigh gets dislocated, it's possible. Reb Abba had updated him that Rav Huna says in the name of Rav that actually it's kosher, and then went over this whole incident that he had with Reb Yirmiyah Bar Abba. And now Reb Abba says to Reb Zera, what about you? Have you heard anything on the topic? So Achi Omar Rav Chia bar Ashi Amarav, and says, Reb Zera, this is what Rav Chia bar Ashi says in the name of Rab, Shmutas Yarech Be'of Treifa. That if the thigh gets disconnected on a bird, it's treif v'chein. And similarly, Reb Yaakov bar Idi, Reb Yochanan says Reb Yaakov bar Idi in the name of Reb Yochanan, Shmutas Yarech Be'of Treifa, that if the thigh gets disconnected from the bone from the socket in a bird, it's treif. Reb Yaakov bar Idi, however, says Reb Yaakov bar Idi, ilmali have Reb Yochanan be'asra de'oruba chavervasa le'atera, that if Reb Yochanan was there, however, when the colleagues, again, I don't know why these are being called as colleagues, these are more as Rebbeim, said le'atera lo parkis, he would not have made a move at all. Meaning, Reb Yochanan had said that if the thigh bone gets disconnected from the socket, it's treif. However, as we're going to see, Rebbe and Reb Chanina said that it is kosher, and says Reb Yaakov bar Idi that Reb Yochanan, who says it's treif, if he would have been there when he heard Rebbe say that it's kosher, he would not have made a move. He would have accepted it from Rebbe immediately. The Omar Reb Chanina, that says Reb Chanina Omar Rebbe, the name of Rebbe Shmutas Yarech Be'ov Kshera, that if the thigh bone gets disconnected in a bird, it remains kosher. Reb Chanina had a chicken that its thigh bone got disconnected. Rebbe, and Reb Chanina brought this chicken to Rebbe to have a look. And Rebbe says, the thigh bone's disconnected, mutter, kosher. So what did Reb Chanina do? Instead of just eating this chicken and throwing the bones in the garbage, that's not what he did. Umalcha Reb Chanina, he preserved it, he salted it. The avamori ba'alacha, and he would use it in his halacha shirim on the topic of treifus. He had this preserved chicken with the thigh disconnected, and avamori but halacha tamidim, he would use it to show and to teach halacha to his pupils. Zehiter li Rebbe, Zehir to the Rebbe, and he would tell them enthusiastically, this Rebbe said it was kosher, this Rebbe said is kosher, that if the thigh bone gets disconnected from the socket, it is kosher. V'leis hilchasa kichol anishmaitza. However, the halacha is not azoy, is not so. Ella, rather, ki adasha'il Rabbi Yossi ben Norai asked Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rather, it's like Rabbi Yossi ben Norai asked Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Kedeiras kone bichama. What if the trachea has a hole in it? How large must that hole be? Amar lo, Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, what do you ask? Mishnah Shlema Shaninu. It's a Mishnah. Adki Sari Talki, as we've learned, that as it's kosher until the hole is the size of an Italian Isser. Amar lo, Valo Rachel Achas. To which Rabbi Yossi ben Arai says to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, but 1 second, but there was an ewe in our neighborhood, shenikdar kone shela, that its trachea got a hole in it. I guess it must have been the size of a Italian Isser. Ve'asula krumin shel kone, and they patched it up. They patched it up with reeds. They used reeds to patch it up. V'chaisa, and it lived. And it lived. So meaning, on the one hand, Rabbi Shua ben Levi says that if there's a hole in the trachea large enough, it is treif. On the other hand, says Rabbi Yossi ben Norai that there was once an example of an ewe that had a trachea that had a hole, and they patched it up, and the ewe lived. Omar lo, to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, unimpressed, responds to Rabbi Yossi ben Norai, the alda at samech, you're relying upon this example with this ewe. The alo, alacha avachas b'Yisrael. What are you going to say about this? There is a broadly accepted alacha amongst Yidden, shmutas yarich ba'ov treifa, that when the thigh bone is disconnected from a bird, it is treif. V'tanagolas aisalo, the Shimon ben Chalafta, and Reb Shimon Chalafta had a chicken, shenishmita yarich shala, that its thigh bone got disconnected from the socket, va'asu la shvofers, and they made a splint, shalkana out of reeds, v'chaisa, and it lived. So says Rabbi Shimon Levi, what are you going to tell me about that scenario? On the one hand, it's broadly accepted that when a thigh bone is disconnected, it's treif, and yet apparently they made Reb Shimon ben Chalafta had a chicken with a dislocated thigh bone, and they just made a splint and it lived. But I thought it's treif. How could it live if it's treif? What do you have to say? Toch yud beis chodesh hava hachanami toch yud beis chodesh hava. Rather, how do you explain the scenario with Reb Shimon Chalafta and his dislocated chicken and the splint? It means that within the next, if it's treif, it can't live for 12 months. But you're telling me it lived. Didn't it live for 12 months? Sure, within the 12 months, it continued to live a little bit more, but it wouldn't have lived. It would live for 12 more months. And the same thing with the u. Sure, they can patch up the trachea, but it's treif. It's not going to last 12 months. Now we wrap up the daf with some interesting anecdotes. Amar Olav Reb Shimon ben Chalafta she'askin b'dvar moya. That says that they would say about Reb Shimon ben Chalafta that it was an askin b'dvarim. What does it mean an askin b'dvarim? So there's an interesting Rashi here. It's actually not on this section, but it's on the next section, but it doesn't matter, because we're introducing it now. Let's see what Rashi has to say. It says, "V'hainu askin." What's an askin? To lo bayi lemisbach ayim nusei deshloma. This has to do with, as we're going to see, he tested out something from Mishlei. But very interesting point is, well, what does it mean? Is an askin? It was kind of an entrepreneur, kind of a problem solver. Right? He says, "To lo bayi lemisbach ayim nusei deshloma." Right? We're going to see in a minute that he basically wanted to test out for himself a claim that Shlomo HaMelech made in Mishlei, but he hears something. He says, "I want to see for myself." He doesn't just accept conventional wisdom. If he hears something, he wants to run experiments and see it for himself. And I imagine maybe also if he has better ways to do them, he'll find better ways to do things. But he's a doer. He's an experimenter, a tinkerer. So, right, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Imnitla Notza Psul. If you remember yesterday from the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda had said that if the small feathers of a chicken are missing, the chicken is pasul. And Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, the Askin, he didn't just accept that as accepted wisdom. He wanted to run a test. And Reb Shimon ben Chalafta had such a bird that its down was missing. And he put it in a warm oven. Obviously, he wasn't right. This bird was alive, and he wasn't looking to kill it or cook it, but he wanted to put it in a warm environment. And he wrapped it b'matla shel tarsim, in the apron of coppersmiths that can. It's a very warm kind of material. It was leather and kind of a warm. Basically, it was in a warm environment, wearing a warm apron. The gidla knafayim, and it grew back those feathers, those down feathers. And not only did it grow back, achronim yosim and arishonim, even more fully and more thickly than the feathers were initially. So we want to bring that as a raya, right? So Shimon ben Chalafta thought that was essentially proof that if the feathers fall off, it's not pasul, still kosher. But Vidilma Kasov Rabbi Yehuda Treifa mishabachas. But maybe Rabbi Yehuda says that. Meaning what's your proof? What's your point? Your point is that, well, if it was treif, how would it be able to grow back these feathers and so plentifully? Well, maybe Rabbi Yehuda is aware that they can grow back, but that doesn't mean it's not treifa. Rabbi Yehuda is saying it's a treifa, and you're saying it can grow feathers. Maybe both things are true. It's treif and it can grow feathers. Yeah, but if so that it was treif though, the midi dimitarfa, in that exact thing that made it treif in the first place, the fact that its down feathers are gone. But higdilo knafayim achronim yosim rishonim, it wouldn't make sense. If Rabbi Yehuda wants to say even things that are treif can still excel in certain areas. Okay, that's great, but it's not going to be able to excel in that exact area that is what's making it treif. So kilu, it's treif because it doesn't have those down feathers. If it was in fact treif because it's unable to make those down feathers, so then it wouldn't be able to now in a warm environment not just produce and replace those down feathers, but even way more than there were initially. Argues with Shimon ben Chalafta, the fact that it grew so many feathers, it must be that it was not treif. My asking b'dvarim, what does it mean that Reb Shimon ben Chalafta was an askin b'dvarim? What other examples do we have of him being this askin? Amr Misharsha says in Misharsha Dichsiv, because the pasuk says in Mishlei, Leich el nimala otzel, oh you lazy guy, why don't you go have a look and consult with the ants? Re'ei drachel v'chacham, see the ways of the ants and become wise. Asher ein lo katzin shoter moshel, you see ants, they don't have officers and rulers and kings. Each person is responsible for that. Each ant is responsible for itself, and yet they waste no time. Tochin bakayitz lachma, and it's preparing its bread in the summer to make sure that it'll have everything that it needs. I think probably for the winter maybe. And nobody's commanding it to do that. It knows what it needs to do and it does its work. Now, Reb Shimon ben Chalafta was intrigued and he wanted to see for himself, is it really true? Sure, we have a pasuk in Mishlei that says that Asher ein lo katzin shoter moshel, but is this really true that they don't have kings? I want to see it for myself. Also, betkufas Tammuz, so his plan was this. He went in the middle of the summer when it was hot out and the ants don't like the heat. Parse leglime akina desum simone. So he went and he spread out his cloak over the ant farm, wherever they were living. Nofak also chad minayu, and one of the ants came out from their ant house. What it was called, the ant farm, ant hill, ant house, I don't know. One of the ants came out and he noticed, wow, it's pretty shady. Let me go tell all the people it's shady out. They will all go out and enjoy the shade. Asnach Bey Simona, and before the ant went back inside, Reb Shimon ben Chalafta made some kind of a marking on the ant so that he'll be able to identify it later. Ol Amr Lehu Nafal Tula. So this ant went back inside and told all of his ant friends, hey, it's shady out. Let's go out and enjoy the shade. Nafku, so they all went out to enjoy the shade. V'asu, they all went out to enjoy this shade. At which point, Reb Shimon ben Chalafta, Dalye Leglime, removed his cloak from on top of the ant farm where it was all shady. Nafal Shimsha, and now the sun was back and it was really hot. And all of the other ants, what did they do? Naflu ale vikatle. They turned against this ant who wasted their time. This ant went inside, said, hey, everybody, it's shady out, let's go out. So everybody went outside. And it was not shady. It was really, really hot out. So they all killed that ant. So Omar, and he was able to tell that it was that ant because he had made some kind of a sign on it that he would be able to distinguish it later. So Reb Shimon ben Chalafta concluded, Shmamina leis lehu malka, clearly ants, in fact, like Shlomo Melech says, don't have a king. The islu harmona de malka lolibai, because if they did have a king, would they not have had to have first asked permission before they could kill this fellow? You can't just have a scenario where everyone's just killing random people when there's a king. You have to ask permission. Says so after Reb Shimon ben Chalafta had concluded that it's correct that ants don't have a king. But then Rava says to Rav Ashi, V'dilma Malka Hava Badayu, maybe they do have a king, and the king also came out. And so the king consented with this summary execution. Inami, alternatively, Harmona de Malko Havanakite. Or maybe, we don't know, maybe they already had permission in advance that if this guy is a shmendrik, kill him. Inami, Ben Malka Malka, or you know what? Maybe ants do have kings, but they were just in between kings. One king had died and they hadn't found a replacement yet. Tichsiv, as the pasuk says in Sefer Shoftim, Bayom Mayim, Ein Melech B'Yisrael, Ish Ayosh Ben of Yaisa. That during the time after the death of Shimshon, it says that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everybody just did whatever they wanted because there was no king. So maybe they were simply in between kings. Ella rather says Rav Ashi, or either Rav Ashi or Rav Acha b'Derava, Smoch Ayim Nusa de Shlomo. You can rely on Shlomo Melech. As Rashi points out, Mishlei was written with Ruach HaKodesh. If Shlomo Melech says that there are no kings for ants, there are no kings for ants. We don't need to go out and do experiments. Friends, that was Daf Nun Zayin of Masechta Chullin. And Daf Nun Zayin of Masechta Chullin, the main focus was really this sugya of when the thigh gets disconnected from its socket. We saw different shitas of Rav, shitas of Rav Yochanan, of Rebbe, about whether it's treif, whether it's not, whether it's kosher. And in the end, we said that the accepted practice is that if the thigh bone gets disconnected from its socket, it would be considered treif. Along the way, we had some looks and some discussions about lungs, maybe whether or not there even are lungs in birds, which is an interesting shita of Chizkiah. But we also saw other shitas about what if the wing gets disconnected, and Rav had said if that happens, then we have to assume that the bird is treif because maybe it punctured a lung. Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan said you just need to check and experiment and blow some air into the lung and make sure that no air is escaping. That was the gist of the Nun Zayin of Masechta Chullin. At the end, we saw some interesting anecdotes with Reb Shimon ben Chalafta, the tinkerer, which was interesting. Friends, I hope you enjoyed. Have a great Shabbos. Cheers.